The Snow Queen in 7 parts by Hans Christian Andersen. The second story, A Little Boy and a Little Girl. In the great town, where there are so many houses and so many people that there's not enough room for everyone to have a little garden, and where consequently most persons are compelled to be content with some flowers in flower pots. There were 2 poor children who possessed a garden somewhat larger than a flower pot. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other quite as much as if they had been. Their parents lived just opposite of each other in 2 garrets. There where the roof of one neighbor's house joined that of another, and where the water pipe ran between the 2 houses was a little window. One had only to step across the pipe to get from one window to the next. The parents of each child had a great box, in which grew kitchen herbs that they used, and a little rose bush. There was one in each box, and they grew famously. Now it occurred to the parents to place the boxes across the pipe, so that they reached from one window to another, and looked quite like 2 embankments of flowers. Pea plants hung down over the boxes, and the rose bushes shot forth long twigs, which clustered round the windows and bent down towards each other. It was almost like a triumphal arch of flowers and leaves. As the boxes were very high, and the children knew that they might not creep upon them, they often obtained permission to step out upon the roof behind the boxes, and to sit upon their little stools under the roses, and there they could play quite capitally. In the winter, there was an end of this amusement. The windows were sometimes quite frozen all over, but then they warmed copper shillings on the stove and held the warm coins against the frozen pane, and it made a capital peephole, so round, and behind it gleamed a pretty mild eye at each window, and these eyes belonged to the little boy and the little girl. His name was Kay, and the little girl's was Gerda. In the summer they could get to one another at one bound, but in the winter they had to go down and up the long staircase, while the snow was pelting without. "Those are white bees swarming," said the old grandmother. "Have they a queen bee?" asked the little boy, for he knew that there was one among the real bees. "Yes, they have one," replied Grandmamma. "She always flies where they swarm thickest. She is the largest of them all, and never remains quiet upon the earth. She flies up again into the black cloud. Many at midnight she is flying through the streets of the town, and looks in at the windows, and then they freeze in such a strange way and look like flowers." "Yes, I've seen that!" cried both the children, and now they knew that it was true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" asked the little girl. "Only let her come!" cried the boy. I'll set her upon the warm stove, and then she'll melt." But grandmother smoothed his hair and told some other tales. In the evening, when little Kay was at home and half undressed, he clambered upon the chair by the window and looked through the little hole. A few flakes of snow were falling outside, and one of them, the largest of them all, remained laying on the edge of one of the flower boxes. The snowflake grew larger and larger, and at last became a maiden clothed in the finest white gauze, put together of millions of starry flakes. She was beautiful and delicate, but of ice, of shining, glittering ice. Yet she was alive. Her eyes flashed like 2 clear stars, but there was no peace or rest in them. She nodded towards the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and sprang down from the chair. Then it seemed as if a great bird flew by outside in front of the window. The next day there was a clear frost, and then the spring came. The sun shone, the green sprouted forth, the swallows built nests, the windows were opened, and the little children again sat in their garden high up in the roof over all the floors. How splendidly the roses bloomed this summer! The little girl had learned a psalm in which mention was made of roses. And, in speaking of roses, she thought of her own. And she sang it to the little boy, and he sang too. The roses will fade and pass away, but we, the Christ child, shall see one day. And the little ones held each other by the hand, kissed the roses, looked at God's bright sunshine, and spoke to it as if the Christ child were there. What splendid summer days those were! How beautiful it was without, among the fresh rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never leave off blooming. Kay and Gerda sat and looked at the picture book of beasts and birds. Then it was, while the clock was just striking 12 on the church tower, that Kay said, "Oh, something struck my heart and pricked my eye." The little girl fell upon his neck. He blinked his eyes. No, there was nothing at all to be seen. "I think it is gone," said he, but it was not gone. It was just one of those glass fragments which sprang from the mirror. The magic mirror that we remember well. The ugly glass that made everything great and good which was mirrored in it seem small and mean, but in which the mean, wicked things were brought out in relief, and every fault was noticeable at once. Poor little Kay had also received a splinter just in his heart, and now that will soon become like a lump of ice. It did not hurt him now, but the splinter was still there. "Why do you cry?" he asked. "You look ugly like that. There's nothing the matter with me." "Oh, fie!" he suddenly exclaimed. "That rose is worm-eaten, and this one is quite crooked. After all, they're ugly roses. They're like the box in which they stand." And then he kicked the box with his foot and tore both of the roses off. "Kay, what are you about?" cried the little girl. And when he noticed her fright, he tore off another rose, and then sprang at his own window, away from pretty little Gerda. When afterwards she came with her picture book, he said it was only fit for babes in arms, and when grandmother told stories, he always came in with a "but," and when he could manage it, he would get behind her and put on a pair of spectacles and talk just as she did. He could do that very cleverly, and people laughed at him. Soon he could mimic the speech and the gait of everybody in the street. Everything that was peculiar or ugly about him, Kay could imitate, and people said, "That boy must certainly have a remarkable head." But it was the glass that stuck deep in his heart. So it happened that he even teased little Gerda, who loved him with all of her heart. His games now became quite different from what they were before. They became quite sensible. One winter's day, when it snowed, he came out with a great burning glass, held up the blue tail of his coat, and let the snowflakes fall upon it. "Now look at the glass, Gerda," said he. And every flake of snow was magnified, and looked like a splendid flower, or a star with 10 points. It was beautiful to behold. "See how clever that is," said Kay. "That's much more interesting than real flowers, and there's not a single fault in it. They're quite regular until they begin to melt." Soon after Kay came in thick gloves and with his sledge upon his back. He called up to Gerda, "I've got to leave to go into the great square where the other boys play." And he was gone. In the great square, the boldest among the boys often tied their sledges to the country people's carts, and thus rode with them a good way. They went capitally. When they were in the midst of their playing, there came a great sledge. It was painted quite white, and in it sat somebody wrapped in a rough white fur, and with a white rough cap on his head. The sledge drove twice around the square, and Kay bound his little sledge to it, and so he drove on with it. It went faster and faster, straight into the next street. The man who drove turned round and nodded in a friendly way to Kay. It was as if they knew one another. Each time when Kay wanted to cast loose his little sledge, the stranger nodded again, and then Kay remained where he was. And thus they drove out at the town gate. Then the snow began to fall so rapidly that the boy could not see a hand's breadth before him, but still he drove on. Now he hastily dropped the cord so as to get loose from the great sledge, but that was of no use, for his sledge was fast bound to the other, and they went on like the wind. Then he called out quite loudly, but nobody heard him. And the snow beat down, and the sledge flew onward. Every now and then it gave a little jump, and they seemed to be flying over hedges and ditches. And the boy was quite frightened. He wanted to say his prayer, but could remember nothing but the multiplication tables. The snowflakes became larger and larger. At last they looked like great white fowls. All at once they sprang aside, and the great sledge stopped, and the person who had driven it rose up. The fur and the cap were made altogether of ice. It was a lady, tall and slender, and brilliantly white. It was the Snow Queen. "We have driven well," said she, "but why do you tremble with the cold? Creep into my fur." And she seated him beside her in her own sledge, and wrapped the fur round him, and he felt as if he sank into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" asked she, and then she kissed him on the forehead. Oh, and that was colder than ice. It went through to his heart, half of which was already a lump of ice. And he felt as if he were going to die, but only for a moment. For then he seemed quite well, and he did not notice the cold all about him. "My sledge! Don't forget my sledge!" That was the first thing he thought of, and it was bound fast to one of the white chickens, and this chicken flew behind him with the sledge upon its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kay again, and then he had forgotten little Gerda, his grandmother, and all at home. "Now you shall have no more kisses," said she, "for if you did, I should kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. She was so beautiful, he couldn't imagine a more sensible or lovely face. She did not appear to him to be made of ice now as before, when she sat at the window and beckoned him. In his eyes she was perfect. He did not feel at all afraid. He told her that he could do mental arithmetic as far as fractions, and that he knew the number of square miles and the number of inhabitants in the country. And she always smiled, and then it seemed to him that what he knew was not enough, and he looked up at the wide sky, and she flew with him high upon the black cloud, and the storm blew and whistled. It seemed as though the wind sang old songs. They flew over woods and lakes, over sea and land. Below them roared the cold wind, the wolves howled, the snow crackled. Over them flew the black screaming crows, but above all the moon shone bright and clear, and Kay looked at the long, long winter night. And by day he slept at the feet of the Queen. Thus ends the second story of the Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. We'll meet again for the third.